Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters and friends, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I pray everybody is well. Today we're going to be going through divine link, the argument from dependency for God's existence. Now, you may have not heard this argument before with regards to the title that I've just conveyed to you, because I like to change the word contingency into dependency. Because in the language of philosophy, of theophilosophy, of the philosophy of religion, the word that is usually used is contingency. But I like to use the word dependency because it's more of a common word, but we are going to define it as it is defined in the philosophy of religion, in theology, which is contingency, the meaning behind the word contingency. So if you're up to date with the philosophy of religion, you will understand this argument as the argument from contingency. And it's a very powerful argument, brothers and sisters and friends. And I tell you why. Because it transcends science. And we're going to talk about this towards the end of the webinar. And what I mean by it transcends science is that today's science, tomorrow's science, science in the next 1,000 years will never ever undermine this argument. Why? Because number one, it is not a scientific argument, it is a metaphysical argument, and it's based on first principles, if you like. And science, from a philosophy of science perspective, is limited. I don't mean that in a bad way, because as Muslims, we are encouraged to do science and we love science. And if you study the history of science, the Muslim civilization, the Islamic civilization was central in promoting science. If you read the autobiographical accounts of Ibn al-Haytham, or you read the history of Ibn al-Haytham, you would see that he was a practicing Muslim, he was a product of the Islamic civilization, and he was a key milestone, if you like, if you want to use those terms, a key milestone in promoting science and developing its method. If you read the works of David C. Lindbergh, for example, the historian of science, and others, you would see the kind of central importance of Ibn al-Haytham, and you could extend that to understand the central importance of the Islamic civilization in promoting science. For example, a cursory analysis of Islamic Spain, you will see that Islamic Spain was actually critical in allowing Europe to progress further with regards to the sciences. You know, you can read the works of Professor Arnold in his book, The Preaching of Islam. He actually made this very clear concerning Islamic Spain. Islamic Spain created that convivencia, that coexistence that allowed Muslims, Christians, and Jews to work together in harmony and tolerance, to look into the interconnecting principles of nature, to develop works on mathematics, on science, on all of these things. And when the Christians took over Spain, Islamic Spain, they actually also took the intellectual content, the books, the manuscripts, and they translated them, and the rest is history. And this is why we have today's civilization. It was as a result of borrowing, if you like, and using the works of the Islamic civilization, the works of Christians, Jews, and Muslims that work together under the convivencia, under the tolerant coexistence of Islamic Spain. So, you know, we love science. So coming back to the point about science is limited, we have to understand that science only deals with things that are contingent, things that are dependent. And I'm going to explain what that means further. And if that's the case, then science doesn't undermine this argument at all. And I'm going to explain this further during the webinar. So what are we going to cover? The first thing that we're going to cover is we're going to cover a summary of the argument. Then we're going to define what we mean by dependent. And if you remember, I've just mentioned we could use the word contingency as a replacement, but I'm going to keep the word dependent because it just sounds easier and it sounds more friendly from a kind of edifying point of view, from a point of view of teaching people this argument. Then we're going to go through the argument. Then I'm going to refer to the Islamic intellectual tradition to show how this argument is actually an argument that is in line with the Quran and in line with the Sunnah and in line with the classical intellectual tradition, which is very important, brothers and sisters and friends. And the reason that is important is because when we try to share Islam, when we try to intellectualize Islam, when we try to defend Islam, we always have to use arguments or concepts and ideas that are in line with the Islamic tradition, that are based on the Quran, the Sunnah, and the intellectual classical tradition. It doesn't have to be direct, it could be indirect, you could infer this argument, but the point is, if we don't have a connection to the Islamic tradition, then further down the line, we're going to end up contradicting ourselves, contradicting our theology, and it's going to basically create far more problems than we're trying to solve. So it's very important that when we intellectualize the Islamic tradition, when we defend it, and when we share Islam, we have to use arguments and concepts that are in line with the Islamic source texts, namely the Quran and the Sunnah and the understanding of the classical scholars. Then we're going to talk about objections. We're going to respond to key objections to this argument, 6 key objections. Yes, there are more than 6 objections that atheists or skeptics or philosophers have tried to respond to this argument with. However, the other objections, I think, are not undercutting defeaters, and the weaker, or the concepts that you're going to acquire in this webinar will allow you to deal with these objections yourself. Then we're going to end on a spiritual note. And this is very important because we don't want to basically just intellectualize for the sake of it. Because when you study the Quran, when you study the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what you would understand is that the main aspect of sharing Islam is trying to get human beings connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, this does imply that they have to believe in a creator, but fundamentally, it's about worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, affirming that there is no deity worthy of worship except Allah. And what does worship entail? It means that we want to know Allah, we want to love Allah, we want to obey Allah, be humble before Him, and we want to direct and single out all acts of worship to Allah alone, the internal acts of worship and the external acts of worship. And this is extremely important. If we don't link our intellectual arguments for God's existence, if we don't link our arguments for God in the Islamic tradition to the fact that He's worthy of worship, then we're really not being holistic. We're basically wasting our time, because we have to understand, just like what we mentioned in the previous webinar, self-evident, when we try to show that the creator of the heavens and the earth is a self-evident truth. You know, when we mention this, we understand that the Islamic tradition affirms this, and the reason it affirms this, because this self-evident truth is already within us. It's within our innate disposition, within our fitrah, and we discussed what the fitrah meant during the previous webinar. And since it's already within us, this truth that Allah is self-evidently true, then what we need to do is focus on the main message of Islam, which is to connect our hearts to Allah and for us to worship Him and to single and direct all acts of worship to Him alone. So it's very important to focus on that. And this is the message of all of the Anbiya, the message of all the messengers, which was that, is there any doubt in the creator of the heavens and the earth? You know, this kind of rhetorical question, rhetorical affirmation, if you like, to say, look, this is so self-evidently true. The main thing we need to pursue is, who is worthy of worship? And it is Allah who is worthy of worship. And this is why we have to link all our arguments to that fact. And it affirms humanity's purpose in life, which is that we're here to worship Allah. So it's very important not just to intellectualize, to be abstract, philosophical, thinkers, but rather to take those good, robust arguments and link it to the fact that Allah is worthy of worship, which is the main call of all the prophets. And that's where we're going to end on a spiritual note. Then we're going to end on some questions. So save your questions. Don't type your questions now. I want you to focus, write your own notes. And when you're ready, at the right time, when we're engaging with questions, then you could ask me some questions. So let's start with a really easy way of summarizing this argument. I want you to imagine this scenario. So imagine you walk out of your house and on your street, you find a row of dominoes that stretch far beyond what your eyes can see. You start to hear a noise that gets slightly louder as time passes. This noise is familiar to you as you used to play with dominoes as a child. It is the sound of them falling. Eventually, you see this amazing display of falling dominoes approaching you. You greatly admire how the basic laws of physics can produce such a remarkable spectacle. However, you are also saddened because the last domino has now fallen a few inches away from your feet. Still excited about what has just happened, you decide to walk down the street to find the first domino, hoping to meet the person responsible for producing this wonderful experience. Now, keep this scenario in your mind. I want to ask you a few questions. As you walk down the street, will you eventually reach where the chain of dominoes began? Or will you keep on walking forever? The obvious response is that you will eventually find the first domino. However, brothers, sisters, and friends, I want to ask you why. Now, the reason you know that you will find the first domino is because you understand that if the domino chain went on forever, the last domino that fell by your feet would have never fallen. An infinite number of dominoes would have to fall before the last domino could fall. Yet, an infinite amount of dominoes would take an infinite amount of time to fall. In other words, the last domino would never fall. Putting this in simple terms, you know that in order for the last domino to fall, the domino must fall prior to it. And for that domino to fall, the domino behind it must fall prior to it. If this went on forever, the last domino would never fall. Now, let's stick with this analogy. I want to ask you another question. Let's say, for example, walking down the street, you finally come across the first domino, which led to the falling of the entire chain. What would your thoughts be about the first domino? Would you think the domino fell by itself? In other words, do you think that the falling of the first domino can somehow be explained without referring to anything external to it? Clearly not. That runs against the grain of our basic intuition about reality. Nothing really happens on its own. Everything requires an explanation of some sort. So the first domino's fall had to have been triggered by something else, a person, the wind, or a thing hitting it, etc. Whatever this something else is, it has to form a part of our explanation of falling dominoes. So, to sum up our reflections, neither could the chain of the dominoes contain an infinite number of items, nor could the first domino start falling for no reason whatsoever. So this analogy, this scenario is a summary of the argument from dependency. The universe is somewhat like a row of dominoes. The universe and everything within it is dependent. They cannot depend on something else, which in turn depends on something else forever. The only plausible explanation is that the universe and everything within it has to depend on someone or something whose existence is in some way independent from the universe and everything else for that matter. Put differently, this thing must not be dependent the way the universe is, because that would just add one more domino to the chain, if you like, which would then require an explanation. Therefore, there must be an independent and eternal being that everything depends upon. Now, this is a summary of the argument. It is not intended for you to now understand this argument, because a good way of teaching any argument is to provide a summary, even if you don't fully understand the summary, and then spend time breaking it down and going through the key concepts in order for you to understand this further. So let's summarize once more. This is a very concise summary of the scenario we've mentioned, and it's a concise summary of the argument from dependency. The universe and all that we perceive is either independent, dependent on something else dependent, or dependent on something independent and eternal. The universe and all that we perceive cannot be independent or dependent on something else dependent. Therefore, the universe and all that we perceive depends on something independent and eternal. Now, in order for you to understand this even further, you have to understand what we mean in this context by dependent. And remember, this is also referred to as contingent in the language of philosophy, or in the language of theophilosophy or theology, or the philosophy of religion. So let's spend some time now really understanding what we mean by dependent. And once you get that understanding, you'll be able to understand this argument in a profound way. So we're going to cover 4 things with regards to the idea of dependency. The first thing is that a dependent thing is not necessary. Now, you have to understand what necessary means in the language of philosophy to understand that a thing is not necessary. So what does necessary mean? What does necessity mean? Now, in the language of philosophy, this means that the thing was impossible for it to have not existed. Let me repeat. When we say something necessarily exists, it means that it was impossible for it to have not existed. So when we say something is not necessary, when we say dependent things are not necessary, this means that things did not have to exist, that the contingent thing, the dependent thing did not have to exist. Let me give you an example. Imagine you wake up at 2 in the morning and you know what? You're hungry. So you walk down the stairs, you walk towards your kitchen, you stumble across the kitchen floor and you reach to the fridge and you open the fridge. And inside the fridge, you see a pen on top of an egg box. A pen on top of an egg box. Now, do you close the fridge and say, well, the pen being on top of the egg box necessarily exists? It doesn't require an explanation. Is that what you're saying? Is that what we're going to say? Of course not. By virtue of what we've just perceived, in this case, the pen on top of the egg box, it raises some questions. How did the pen go on top of the egg box? And this raises the idea in our minds that there must be an external explanation that explains the existence of the pen on top of the egg box. Frankly, brothers and sisters, it just doesn't explain itself. The pen on top of the egg box does not explain itself. There is nothing necessary about the pen being on top of the egg box. We have to provide an explanation. And that explanation is an explanation external to the pen and the egg box. It's an external explanation. It could be an external set of factors. It could be an external explanation. The point is, it requires an explanation. For instance, in this case, it could have been, my son being a little bit cheeky and he was told to clean up his pens and paper, and he decided to take one of the pens and put it in the fridge and put the pen on top of the egg box. That's an explanation for sure. But the point here is, irrespective of what type of explanation we think is the most plausible explanation, we know that just by opening the fridge and seeing the pen on top of the egg box, it cries out for an explanation, an external explanation. It requires an external set of factors or an external explanation to explain the pen on top of the egg box. So this is what this is what we mean by something being dependent being not necessary. There's nothing necessary about the existence of the pen on top of the egg box in your fridge or in my fridge. We know just by virtue of what we've perceived that there must be an external explanation or an external set of factors to explain the pen being on the egg box. So this is the first definition of dependency. The second definition of dependency is that its fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. There's nothing necessary about that particular arrangement, okay? There must have been something external to that thing that determined that specific arrangement of its fundamental building blocks. Let me explain this with another scenario, another analogy. Imagine you're driving and you are driving to your mother's house. And if you know the United Kingdom very well, say your mother lives in Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes was a town that was designed from bottom up, I believe. It's a relatively new town, and there's a hell of a lot of roundabouts. Yeah, there are so many roundabouts in Milton Keynes. So imagine you have to go around one roundabout and you have to take the third exit. Now, as you're driving safely, hopefully, you see on the roundabout it's full of grass. And on the roundabout, there's an arrangement of flowers, and it says, "I love you." That's what it says. So there is an arrangement of flowers on the grassy area of the roundabout, and it says, "I love you." Now, here is a question. The fundamental building blocks of that arrangement, for argument's sake, are the individual flowers. Now, is there anything necessary about that arrangement of individual flowers? No, because we know it could have said, "I adore you," or it could have said, "I hate you," or it could have said, "Have a nice day," or it could have said anything, right? It could have said, "I love Nadeem Naz," right? A very close friend of mine. So it could have said those things. By virtue of that, we know there's an external explanation to explain the fundamental building blocks arrangement. For instance, in this case, it could have been a gust of wind, or it could have been a gardener. The point here is, I'm not telling you what is the right explanation. In order to understand what we mean by dependency, we just need to understand that there are fundamental building blocks to that particular arrangement, which are the individual flowers, and that particular arrangement does not necessarily exist. There must have been something external to it that determined that specific arrangement. Okay, if we don't postulate this, if we don't affirm this, it's a major problem. We would have to now believe that the arrangement of flowers in that way is necessary. There was no other way but that way. But we know that can't be the case based on what we've just perceived. The third definition, which is a very basic definition, as you can see, this beautiful cat, it's eating some cat food. Now, the reason I've put that cat there is because that cat is obviously dependent on what? In this case, it's dependent on some cat food. So the third definition is simple. It basically means that a dependent thing relies on something outside of itself for its existence. This is a common sense and intuitive understanding of the word. Another way of explaining it is that a dependent thing is not self-sustaining. It doesn't sustain itself. Just like us as a human being, we are dependent by virtue of the fact that we need some love, we need some TLC, right? We need some food, we need oxygen, we need sunlight. We don't sustain ourselves. There is something external to us, right? There's something external to us that allows us to survive and to sustain ourselves. From this perspective, we understand a dependent thing is not self-sustaining, it's not self-sufficient, it requires something outside of itself, external to itself to exist. Finally, and this is a very important point, number 4, this now is what I would call the kind of defining features or defining aspects of a dependent thing, which is that dependent thing has limited physical qualities. Limited physical qualities. Now, what does this mean? Imagine you're holding your phone. Actually, try and hold your phone right now. I'm holding my phone right now. Very nice iPhone. Alhamdulillah. So I'm holding the iPhone and I see that this iPhone has limited physical qualities. For instance, it has a limited size, volume, shape. It has a particular color, a particular temperature. It has a particular charge maybe. The point here is there are limited physical qualities in this iPhone. No matter how many times they upgrade the iPhone, It's always going to have limited physical qualities, right? Because it's going to have a particular shape, a particular size, a particular volume, a particular charge, a particular temperature. It's going to have a particular color. Now, by virtue of that, we could ask the following questions. Why does it have these limits? Why is the iPhone I have now not twice the size? Why is it black? Why can't it be red? Or why can't it be maroon? Or why can't it be yellow? Why does it have this charge and not that charge? Why does it have this weight? Why is it, for example, 50 grams or not 500 grams? In order to answer this question, we're never going to say, oh, that's easy because the iPhone gave rise to its own limitations. No, things that have limited physical qualities, and this is very important for you to understand, do not give rise to their own limitations. I repeat, things with limited physical qualities do not give rise to their own limitations. So what does this mean? It raises another question. Well, how did they get these limitations? Aha, something external to them gave rise to those limitations. It could have been an external source or an external set of factors or an external explanation, external to the phone, for example, that gave rise to its limitations. In this case, it was the designer, it was the manufacturer, it was the person who put the phone together and assembled it in China, or was it assembled in California? Who knows? Doesn't matter. The point is there is an external set of factors or an external source or an external explanation that gave rise to those limitations. Now you could use another example. Let's take, for example, my book that I'm holding my book right now, The Divine Reality, okay? It has a particular shape, particular color, size, temperature, volume, weight. It's around, this version is around over 350 pages, you know, and we know that there are these limitations. So we could raise these questions. Why is it not twice the size? Why are you lazy, Hamza? Why is it only just over 350 pages? Why isn't it 700 pages? Why does it have around 600 references and not only 100 and something references like Richard Dawkins? Yeah, because Richard Dawkins' fiction book, I like to call them fiction books because they're not really intellectual. The one called The God Delusion only has around 100 something references. You know, why can't it be just like Richard Dawkins, right? You know, so the point is, it has limitations. There are limited physical qualities of this book: size, shape, color, volume, weight, temperature, etc., etc. Now, we're not going to be so silly to say, you know what? The book, The Divine Reality, gave rise to its own limited physical qualities. Of course it didn't. There is an external explanation, an external source, or an external set of factors that gave rise to the book's limitations. In this case, me. In this case, the Amazon printing company, or whatever the case may be. So hopefully you've understood this concept. Something that is contingent or something that is dependent has limited physical qualities. Now, you're well equipped to understand what the word dependency means. Let's now move on to the crux of the matter. Let's move to the main argument. So let's go back to the main argument and apply this to the universe. Number one, the universe and everything we perceive do not necessarily exist. They could have not existed. Now, even scientists agree with this point, okay? It's very important to understand there's nothing physically necessary about this particular universe. So when we're applying this concept of dependency on the universe, we will understand that the universe doesn't necessarily exist. In actual fact, we can raise the question that the universe could have been different. In actual fact, this universe didn't have to be here at all. There is nothing that we perceive within the universe or nothing that we understand about the universe that gives rise to the assertion that the universe had to be the way that it is and that the universe necessarily exists. This is not even articulated by scientists. Scientists agree that the universe could have been different, with a different set of laws, and in actual fact, the universe didn't have to be here at all. This shows that the universe and everything we perceive do not necessarily exist. We're not saying that it was impossible for the universe to have not existed, not at all. We're saying it's actually possible that the universe that we have today could have not existed. And what we're saying here is that the universe could have existed, but it could have been totally different. The second point, to apply the concept of dependency on the universe. Now, if we think about the fundamental building blocks of the universe, right? And the fundamental building blocks of everything that we perceive in the universe, they could have been arranged in a different way. Now, I'm not going to claim I'm some kind of, expert in science, because as I said, this argument transcends science. So even if you think the fundamental building blocks of the universe are quarks, or if you think it's some type of quantum haze, or some kind of quantum field, or some kind of, I don't know, probability, or some kind of fluctuating energy, irrespective of what you think the fundamental building blocks of the universe are, the point is they could have been arranged differently. There's nothing necessary about the arrangement of the fundamental building blocks of the universe and the fundamental building blocks of things that exist within the universe. They could have been arranged differently, which raises the question, what external thing or external cause or external set of factors determine that particular arrangement? The other thing that we could postulate now, since we understand what the word dependency means, is that the universe and everything that we perceive have limited physical qualities. Because we could ask, why does the universe have these limits? Why is it this size and not another size? Why are the things within the universe a particular size and not, say, for example, twice the size? The point here is, when we perceive things within the universe, and even when we try to understand and perceive the universe itself, we understand that even if it's really big or really large or really small, the point here is it has some type of limited physical quality. So why that limited physical quality and not another type of limited physical quality? And we can't say that the universe and everything that we perceive within it gave rise to its own limitations, because we have already understood the concept of dependency, that dependent things or things with limited physical qualities do not give rise to their own limitations. There must have been an external set of factors or an external cause or an external explanation that gave rise to their limited physical qualities. So what does this mean? So when we apply the concept of dependency to the universe, we understand now, well, the universe is dependent. The universe is contingent. Why? Remember, the universe doesn't necessarily exist. Remember, the fundamental building blocks of the universe and things that we perceive in the universe, their fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. So there must be an external set of factors or something external to it or to them that determine that particular arrangement. Also, we know that the universe and everything that we perceive within it has limited physical qualities. And we know things with limited physical qualities do not give rise to their own limitations, which means there's an external set of factors or an external cause or an external explanation that gave rise to those limitations. Therefore, the universe, lo and behold, brothers and sisters and friends, is dependent. So now let's move on. So we could now start fleshing out and unpacking the argument. So we have three things that we can talk about, okay? So we mentioned this in the beginning. Well, we can say the universe and all that we perceive are actually eternal, necessary, and independent, right? That's a possibility. That's a rational explanation. That would solve all our conceptual philosophical problems now, right? But the question is this possible? Is it possible that the universe and all that we perceive are eternal, necessary, and independent? Well, no. But why? Because we've just discussed that the universe is dependent. When we've understood the concept of dependency and we've applied it to the universe, we know the universe doesn't necessarily exist. We know the universe and everything within it with regards to its fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. And we also know that the universe and everything within it has limited physical qualities, therefore requires an external explanation or external set of factors that gave rise to those limitations. So we can't postulate the universe and all that we perceive are eternal, necessary, and independent, because we've just discussed that actually the universe is actually dependent. So this means it can't be necessary, and this means it can't be independent. So this first possible explanation is frankly not possible. It's impossible. It's not rational. What about the second possible explanation? The universe and all that we perceive depend for their existence on something else which is also dependent. Now, does this make sense? Well, think about it. Maybe it does. Maybe this universe and its dependency and everything within it and their dependency is actually explained by something else which is also dependent. Why not? We see this all the time. For example, we spoke about the dependent nature of my book. It was as a result of me and Amazon. Now, I'm definitely not independent. I don't necessarily exist. Amazon are not independent, and Amazon doesn't necessarily exist. So it makes sense. The book, the divine reality, which is dependent, was as a result of some things that were also dependent, me and Amazon. So there you go. We've solved the problem, right? We don't need God anymore. That's what some atheists will say, because a dependent thing is explained by another dependent thing. Hold your intellectual horses, though. Just hold them for one moment. Or if you're if you like, hold your ponies, whatever you like, horses or ponies, it depends. So hold your horses here. This doesn't make sense. Why? Because it doesn't provide an explanation, ultimate explanation. And let me give an example. If we said the universe, which is dependent, was as a result of another universe, which is also dependent, then we need to still ask the same questions of that dependent thing that gave rise to the universe. Because we could say, well, why is that thing dependent? What explains that dependent thing that gave rise to the universe? And if you say, well, another dependent universe or another dependent thing, then you could ask the question about that thing too. Now, if that goes on forever, we would never have an ultimate explanation. In actual fact, we wouldn't have the universe itself. Because if this universe and everything within it are dependent, and the universe and everything within it is as a result of something else dependent, and that dependent thing is also as a result of something else dependent, and that dependent thing, which obviously requires an explanation, is as a result of something else dependent, and that dependent thing, which obviously requires an explanation because it's dependent, is also dependent on something else dependent, and that goes on forever. Would we ever have a satisfactory explanation? In actual fact, would we ever have the universe? No, because this is the absurdity of an infinite regress of dependent things, or the absurdity of the infinite regress of causes. Let me give you another example to understand this. Say, for example, I have a water gun and it's a very sunny day in July, and I filled up my water gun with cold water, and I want to play a water fight with my friend Nadim Naz. Now, before I shoot him in the face with the water, I have to ask permission or gain some kind of causal power, if you like, or derive my ability to do so from somebody else. Now, if that somebody else also has to gain that causal power or that permission, it has to gain that permission from somebody else, and that goes on forever, I will never shoot Nadim with my water pistol because of the infinite regress of me asking for permission or of that permission. Let me give you another example. Say, for example, I travel to London and I have a £50 note. And to travel on a London bus, I haven't done it for a while, say it costs £2. And I give the bus driver the £50 note. He has to give me £48 change. Now that's a lot of change for a bus driver, right? If he's nice and friendly, we're like, just get in, don't worry. But if he has a little bit more integrity, he'll be like, no, I have to give you this change. But he doesn't have the change. So what does he do? He calls his boss. Boss, can I have permission to give this guy £48 change? Because I don't have much change. And if I give him all the change, then we might run out. And then the boss says, you know what? That's a difficult question. I have to call my boss. But if that boss also has to call his boss, and then that boss has to call his boss, and that goes on forever, would I ever get my change? No. So this shows, it's an example, it's an illustration of the absurdity of the infinite regress of dependencies or the infinite regress of causes. Likewise, when we apply this to the universe cannot derive its existence from something else that is dependent, and that dependent thing cannot derive its existence from something else that's dependent ad infinitum if that goes on forever, because we would never have the universe today. So the final explanation here is, as we mentioned in the beginning, that the universe and all that we perceive depends for their existence on something else that exists by its own nature, and that is accordingly eternal and independent. Now, is this a rational explanation? Of course, it's a rational explanation. It is the most rational explanation. But before I get into why it's the most rational explanation, let's talk about the universe being eternal. What if someone really says, fine, the universe is not independent, the universe is not necessary, but what if the universe was eternal? Wouldn't that answer everything? No. By the way, in Islamic theology, we do not believe the universe is eternal. According to the mainstream ulama, scholars, the classical tradition, if you believe that something other than Allah is eternal, that is tantamount to kufr. That is tantamount to disbelief, because you're basically associating partners with Allah, because only Allah is eternal. So just for argument's sake, hypothetically speaking, say someone said, okay, the universe is eternal. This still wouldn't undermine the argument, because imagine the following, right? Imagine there are an infinite number of human beings, okay? Each human being was produced by the biological activity of their parents, and each of their parents were produced by the biological activity of their parents ad infinitum, forever. Wouldn't it still be perfectly reasonable to ask, why are there any human beings at all? Wouldn't it be reasonable to say that if each human being is dependent, then the infinite chain is also dependent, right? Because you could look at each point in the chain. You could look at a particular human being. This human being is dependent, and it derives its existence from something else that is dependent. Now, even if you were to argue that chain goes on forever, that doesn't now necessarily mean that the whole chain, the whole infinite chain, is now independent, because it doesn't follow just because something is eternal from a philosophical perspective that it is now necessarily existing and that it is independent. Okay, and this is something very important to understand, because dependent things make up dependent wholes. This is the principle of dependency. Irrespective if someone were to postulate in some crazy way that the universe is eternal but it's made up of dependent things, the universe is still dependent even if you think it's eternal, because dependent things make up dependent wholes. This is the principle of dependency. And for someone to reject this, then they have to provide some kind of philosophical or otherwise proof to show that no, dependent things make up independent wholes, yeah, which would be very difficult to prove. So even if the universe were eternal, we could still say it's dependent. And if it's dependent, therefore requires an explanation outside of itself, or an explanation that is not itself. So it requires an external explanation that explains its dependency. But obviously, you know, from the Islamic traditional perspective, we never assert that the universe is eternal. But if someone were to clutch at intellectual straws and say, you know what, I just believe the universe is eternal, therefore we don't need to have an explanation for its existence, therefore, you know, it could be necessary in some way. No, it doesn't solve the problem. Even if it was eternal, it's still dependent by virtue of what we've just discussed. So let's go back to the rational conclusion. The rational conclusion is that all we sense depends for its existence on something else that exists by its own nature and that is accordingly eternal and independent. So the universe and everything within it and everything that we perceive is as a result of something that is eternal and independent. Now, why is it independent? Because if it were dependent, it would require an explanation. And then we've got the problem of the infinite regress of dependencies. And it must be eternal, because if it was not eternal, in other words, finite, it would be dependent. Because all dependent things, or the things that we perceive that are dependent, actually are finite. And finite things require an explanation for their existence. Because if you remember, we define dependent, an aspect of dependency is that it has limited physical qualities. In other words, those things are finite. If they're finite, they require an explanation. So if someone were to say that this thing now that explains the whole universe is actually not eternal, then that's not an explanation, because that means that thing now is also dependent, which brings us back to the same problem of the infinite regress of dependencies. Therefore, we can conclude, brothers and sisters and friends, that the universe and everything that we perceive depends on something that is eternal and independent, and this is best explained by God, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this leads us to the Islamic tradition. What does Islam say about this? Well, let's think about this very clearly, carefully. This whole argument has an Islamic basis. For example, in the Quran in chapter 3, verse 97, what does Allah say? God, Allah, is independent of all that exists. Also in the Quran chapter 35, verse 15, Allah says, O mankind, it is you who stand in need of Allah, of God, whereas He alone is self-sufficient, the one whom all praise is due. Now, interestingly, our classical tradition affirms this as well. The classical exegete, the one who did tafsir, or the one who did an explanation of the Quran, Ibn Kathir, may Allah have mercy on him, he comments on the above verse. He says, they need Him in all that they do, and He has no need of them at all. He is unique in His being free of all needs and has no partner or associate. Also, when you look into Islamic theology, you see terms, if you study the books of creed, you will see terms in Arabic such as wajib al-wujud and mumkin al-wujud. Now, what does wajib al-wujud mean? It means the necessarily existent. Mumkin al-wujud means things that are dependent. They are possibly existing. There's nothing necessary about their existence. And you know, the Islamic intellectual tradition produced the likes of Ibn Sina, who articulated a similar argument. Notwithstanding some of Ibn Sina's theological issues, the point is many of the scholars actually use some of Ibn Sina's works concerning the necessarily existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why you had the likes of Al-Ghazali. He actually articulated this in a beautiful summary in one of his books. And he said, there is no denying existence itself. Something must exist, and anyone who says nothing exists at all makes a mockery of sense and necessity. The proposition that there is no denying being itself then is a necessary premise. Now, this being, which has been admitted in principle, is either necessary or contingent. Remember, contingent also means dependent. What this means is that a being must be self-sufficient or dependent. From here we argue, if the being, the existence of which is conceded by necessary, then the existence of a necessary being is established. If, on the other hand, its existence is contingent, every contingent being depends on a necessary being. For the meaning of its contingency is that its existence and non-existence are equally possible. So it could have not existed and it could have existed. Whatever has such a characteristic cannot have its existence selected for without a determining or selecting agent. This too is necessary. So from these necessary premises, the existence of a necessary being is established. Now, I'm not going to even claim that you should have understood this paragraph. The point of this paragraph was to show that our Islamic intellectual tradition have articulated this argument, and the tradition itself has spoken about concepts such as necessity and dependency and contingency. As I said, you'll find it in the creed books of all the three main schools of creed, the Ash'ira, the Maturidis, and the Atharis. When you read, for example, explanations of books of creed like Aqidat Hawiyah, you would see words like mumkin al-wujud, wajib al-wujud, the necessary existing, the contingent. So this is just to show that this argument can be derived from the Islamic intellectual tradition and the Islamic source texts. So now we go to the objections. We'll go through the 6 objections, brothers and sisters and friends. Then we'll have some questions and answers. So objection number 1, the universe exists independently. Now you may be thinking, Hamza, why are you bringing this into the equation when we've already discussed that it's impossible for the universe to exist independently? I know, I agree, it is frustrating, but sometimes when you articulate this argument to some atheists, they still come with this objection. And this is because sometimes people are not very attentive to the argument. So let's just review this very quickly. So a typical atheist contention could be, well, if we're saying that God is independent and necessary, why can't we say the same thing for the universe? Well, this is a misplaced contention for the following reasons. Firstly, there is nothing necessary about the universe. It could have not existed. We already discussed this throughout the webinar. Secondly, the components of the universe could have been arranged in a different way. Whether one considers these components to be quarks or some kind of quantum field, it still raises the question, why are they arranged in that way? This means there must be an external set of factors or causes or an explanation that gave rise to that particular arrangement of the components or the fundamental building blocks of the universe. So we can't say that the universe is independent. The second objection, objection number 2, the universe is a brute fact. Now, I think this was from the words of the grandfather of new atheism, Bertrand Russell, when he had a BBC radio debate. He said, just get over it. Stop asking the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Stop asking the question why the universe exists at all. Do we have an explanation of the universe? It's just a brute fact. Now, an easy way of dealing with this is this. Well, firstly, this argument, in my view, undermines science because, and this is something I should have mentioned in the beginning, the intellectual motivation for this argument is as follows. It is the mark of a rational mind to question that which didn't have to be. Let me repeat. It is a sign of a rational mind to question that which did not have to be. So if you're saying the universe is a brute fact, just ignore it, you're really denying one of the key intellectual driving forces of science itself. Because the whole point of science is to question that which didn't have to be, is to question things. If you're undermining it in this sense, it's equivalent, in my view, of undermining the whole of science. In actual fact, it's equivalent of undermining established scientific domains of knowledge, such as astronomy. We ask questions about the universe all the time and we're trying to find scientific answers. Why are you allowed to ask those questions for astronomy, but you don't want to ask those questions for the universe itself? You can't have your intellectual cake and eat it. And the way to deal with this brute fact contention is to talk about the hovering blue ball. Imagine you're walking in a park and you're with your friends. I'm with Nadeem Naz, and walking in the blue park, and we see a hovering blue ball. Do you look at the hovering blue ball and do you say, you know what, that hovering blue ball exists there necessarily, it doesn't require an explanation? Of course not. By virtue of just perceiving the blue ball, we could raise the questions, why does it exist? Why is it hovering? Why is it there? Why is it there and not there, right? It could have not been there, for example. So by virtue of what we just perceived, we know requires an explanation. The blue ball is not a brute fact. The hovering blue ball is not a brute fact. So take this blue ball now and expand it to the size of the Earth. The same questions apply. Why does it exist? It could have not existed. Why is it there? Now take that blue ball and now expand it to the size of the galaxy. Same questions apply. Now take that blue ball and expand it to the size of the universe. Same questions apply. We can't say the universe is a brute fact by virtue of this example, of the hovering blue ball example. The third objection, and this is an objection that comes up a lot, and I want you guys to really focus on this, right? Because we live in a kind of science world. Actually, that's the wrong way of putting it. A lot of people adopt scientism to be true, that science is the best way to understand the world and reality, or the only way to render the truth about the world and reality. And that's why they usually say, well, you know what, science will eventually find an answer. Well, firstly, this postulation itself is ridiculous, because science has limitations. If you studied the philosophy of science, if you went through Sabur Ahmed's webinar about does science disprove God, you will understand that science is beautiful, it's amazing, but it has limitations. For example, science can't answer everything. For example, I don't know, science can't make you fall in love, or science can't, you know, prove the fundamental nature of testimony, which is a valid source of knowledge in the epistemology of testimony, for example. I'm not going to go into detail concerning this. You could look at the recording of the webinar. But the point here is, you know, that's one of the motivations of this objection, because people think science can answer everything. But it's not the case. with regards to this argument. That's why I said this argument is so powerful, because it transcends science. One of the most powerful aspects of this argument is that even you use today's science, tomorrow's science, or science in the next 1,000 or 10,000 years, this argument will transcend anything you bring to it. Why? Number one, this argument is not scientific argument. It's a metaphysical one. It's based on key first principles that exist irrespective of your scientific data. Also, you have to understand the nature of science. For example, if you read the essay Empiricism by the atheist philosopher of science, Elliot Sober, he basically says that scientists at any moment in time are limited to the observations they have at hand, direct or indirect observations. Well, let's think about the nature of observations. The nature of observations are that they are dependent things. Remember, all observations, by virtue of being able to observe them, have limited physical qualities. Therefore, they are dependent. Science can never give you an explanation. Science can never give you an observation that is necessary. That's the point. It can never say to you, here's a physical thing, here's an observation, and that thing necessarily exists. That's impossible. Why? Number one, because of the limitations of science. And number two, if you can observe it, it means it has limited physical qualities. And if it has limited physical qualities, it means it's dependent. And this is why even if someone says an infinite number of other universes, brought this universe into existence, even if you were to postulate such a claim, the point here is that doesn't solve the problem, because those universes have limited physical qualities. They could be observed, they have limited physical qualities, they have the features of a dependent thing. Therefore, it doesn't solve the problem. You need a better explanation. In other words, something that necessarily exists to explain everything that is dependent. So anything that science could come up with is, by virtue of the scientific method, going to be dependent, because observed things have limited physical qualities, therefore they are dependent. So this is not based on any gap in our understanding of science, and this is very important for you to understand. Objection number 4, and this is a very key objection that you hear a lot from the atheist community. It's called the fallacy of composition. Okay, what is the fallacy of composition? Well, firstly, I want to let you know that this is a misplaced fallacy when we're talking about the argument from dependency. But before we get into that, let's talk about what we mean by the fallacy of composition. Now, the fallacy of composition is a fallacy of reasoning that mistakenly concludes the whole must have the same properties as its individual parts. Okay, so in this context, the objector may argue that the universe is not dependent, even though it's made up of dependent things. It could be necessary, even though it's made up of dependent things. Okay. However, you have to understand that not all fallacies are universal. They have to be applied. And this fallacy cannot be applied to the universe. Now, before I explain why that's the case, let me give you an example of the fallacy working, okay? An example of the fallacy working. Let's take the example of a Persian rug. Right, if you were to buy a Persian rug, Persian rugs are quite heavy. Persian rugs are quite heavy. Now, a Persian rug, it's made up of individual threads. Now, the individual threads are light in weight, Now, no one's going to say, just because the Persian rug is made up of individual threads that are light in weight, therefore, the Persian rug is light in weight. It doesn't follow. That would be the logical fallacy of the fallacy of composition. Just because the individual parts, in this case, the threads are light in weight, it doesn't now follow that the whole Persian rug is now light in weight. So this is true. This is a good example of the fallacy of composition, but it's not universal. Let me give you an example where you can't apply this fallacy. Take, for example, a brick wall. The individual parts of the brick wall are the bricks, right? And the bricks are hard. Now, it does follow that the bricks, if you put them all together to make a brick wall, that the brick wall is also hard. So this is an example where the fallacy doesn't apply, because the individual parts of the brick wall, which are the bricks, are hard. It does follow that the whole wall is hard. So what I'm trying to show to you here is that the logical fallacy has to be applied in the correct way. Now, when atheists talk about the fallacy of a composition with regards to this argument, it is misplaced. Why? And I've mentioned this earlier. This fallacy cannot be applied to the universe because of the principle of dependency. Dependent parts always make up dependent wholes. Just like the brick wall, right? You have individual bricks that are hard, the brick wall is going to be hard. Likewise, if you're going to have things that are dependent in the universe that make up the universe, then the universe is also going to be dependent. Now, the onus of proof is going to be on the atheist to show to you that dependent parts do not make up dependent wholes, which is irrational. So this is why this fallacy cannot be applied to the argument from contingency. Another objection, objection number 5. Hey Hamza, you've assumed God's existence in this argument. You've assumed him and you've let him creep in from the back door, the intellectual back door. Now that is not true. So why is it not true? Well, firstly, they argue that we have made up the idea of necessity in order to lead to God, right? That's what we're basically saying. That's what they're saying. This is not true, because the dependency of the universe and everything that we perceive has led to the idea there must be an eternal, independent being that exists necessarily. And we're saying that this conclusion makes sense of the Islamic definition of God. Also, the idea of necessity and dependency are well known and discussed in the philosophy of religion and theophilosophy and theology, right? And we didn't make up these concepts just to allow God to sneak through the intellectual back door. The ideas of necessity, the ideas of dependency or contingency in this case are not made up ideas. We didn't just make them up in order to basically presume the existence of God. That's not the case at all. So again, this is a misplaced objection. Final objection. Hamza, doesn't God require an explanation? You know, you're saying dependent things require an explanation. What about God? Well, hold on a second. This again is a misunderstanding, because the argument that we presented in this webinar hasn't concluded that so the argument presented in this webinar has concluded that there must be an eternal, independent being that necessarily exists. Now, this makes sense of the Islamic conception of God. Okay, so if God is that thing that necessarily exists, then by virtue of that, God doesn't require an explanation because he necessarily exists. It was impossible for him to have not existed. And remember what we said about necessity. A necessary being does not require an explanation. If it did, it wouldn't be necessarily existing anymore. It would be dependent. And this is why, from a technical point of view, such a being doesn't require an explanation that refers something external to it, just like dependent things. A necessary being is explained by virtue of its own existence. In other words, it was impossible for it to have not existed. Therefore, it does not require an explanation external to itself. So you can't say, well, doesn't God require an explanation? That would assume that God is dependent. But this argument that we've presented has concluded there must be an eternal, independent being that exists necessarily, and that makes sense of God. So if you're saying, well, God requires an explanation, all you're really saying now is, well, there is no thing such as an eternal, independent being that exists necessarily. Well, that can't be the case, because this whole webinar has asserted the opposite, that there is an eternal, independent being that exists necessarily, and things that exist necessarily are explained by virtue of their own existence. They do not require an external explanation to themselves. They explain themselves from that point of view, because it was impossible for them to have not existed. So let's end on a spiritual note. As I said to you, it's very important to link all of our arguments to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As I said in the beginning, you know, if you just abstract theological, philosophical arguments will get us nowhere in the dawah. As I said in the beginning, we have to awaken the truth that's within everybody, within everyone's fitrah. And that truth is that Allah exists and he is worthy of extensive praise or worship. And the Anbiya came to teach us La ilaha illallah. There is no deity worthy of worship except Allah. And what does worship mean? And we're going to go into detail in another webinar concerning why Allah is worthy of worship. But in summary, Worshipping Allah entails that we want to know Allah, we want to love Allah, we want to obey Allah, be humble before Him, and direct all our internal and external acts of worship to Allah alone. And one of these acts of worship, especially the internal acts of worship, is having a sense of dependency on Allah. We know we are ultimately dependent on Allah. And this beautiful story by Guy Eaton is a phenomenal story that actually summarizes our dependency on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we've concluded there is a necessary being that makes sense of Allah, and that this necessary being is independent. Therefore, everything dependent, such as our own selves, is ultimately dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I want you to listen to this following marvelous story that teaches us that, because since we are ultimately dependent on Allah, and our success in this life and the hereafter lies with His boundless mercy, which is submit to Allah and accomplish His will. Ready for the story? Let's go. One day, I set out to tend my fields, accompanied by my little dog, sworn enemies of the monkeys which ravaged the plantations. It was the season of great heat. My dog and I were so hot that we could scarcely breathe. I began to think that one or other of us would soon fall in a faint. Then, thank God, I saw a tiaki tree, the branches of which presented a vault of refreshing greenery. My dog gave little cries of joy and turned towards this blessed shade. When he had reached the shade, instead of staying where he was, he came back to me with his tongue out. Seeing how his flanks were palpitating, I realized how completely exhausted he was. I walked towards the shade. My dog was full of joy. Then for a moment, I pretended to continue on my way. The poor beast groaned plaintively, but followed me nonetheless, his tail between his legs. He was obviously in despair, but determined to follow me, whatever might come of it. This fidelity moved me profoundly. How could one fully appreciate the readiness of this animal to follow me, even to death, although he was under no constraint to do so? He is devoted to me, I said to myself, because he regards me as his master, and so risks his life simply to stay beside me. Oh, my Lord, I cried, heal my troubled soul. Make my fidelity like that of this being whom I call contemptuously a dog. Give me, as you have given him, the strength to master my life, so that I may accomplish your will and follow, without asking where I'm going, the path upon which you guide me. I am not the creator of this dog, yet he follows me in docility at the cost of 1,000 sufferings. It is you, Lord, who has gifted him with this virtue. Give, O Lord, to all those who ask of it, you, as I do, the virtue of love and the courage of charity. Then I retracted my steps and took refuge in the shade. Full of joy, my little companion lay down facing me, so that his eyes were turned to mine, as though he wished to speak to me seriously. Now, this is a really nice story that shows our dependency to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to really reiterate this point, the Quran, the best book, actually articulates this point extremely well. In the 100th chapter, what does Allah say? Allah talks about the racers, the horses panting. So by the racers panting, and the producers of sparks when striking, and the chargers at dawn, stirring up thereby clouds of dust, arriving thereby in the center collectively, indeed, mankind to his Lord is ungrateful. Think about this. There's a cinematographic display going on here. Thinking about the horses of war, that they're panting and they're galloping and they're producing sparks with the hooves are striking on the ground, and you could tell it's still dark. And it's the chargers at dawn, and it's stirring up their clouds of dust. And they arrive thereby in the center collectively. It's chaos, it's war. And then Allah says, indeed, mankind is to his Lord ungrateful. What's the link between the horses of war and this cinematographic display and the fact that mankind is ungrateful to his Lord? The link is this. Allah is saying to us, look at these horses, these animals. They obey their instincts. They don't want to die. They want to survive. Yet they listen to go to war, and they sacrifice their health and well-being and their life for their master, which is the one who's riding the horse. And Allah is trying to say to us, the master of the rider and the master of the horse is Allah. But do we obey and submit to Allah like the horse submits to us? This is something very important to understand. And when we understand that everything is dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we'll obey and submit to Him, and that would give us a sense of true liberation and freedom. And it would basically transcend our egos and break our egos, because once you submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have freed yourself from the shackles of your own self. As Allah says in the Quran, have you not seen the one who obeys his own desires, who takes his Lord as his own desires? So that's the end of the webinar, brothers and sisters and friends. We have around 16 minutes to go through some questions. So now is the time for some questions, inshallah. For you to ask the questions, there's a dialogue box, should be on the right hand side, and it says questions. You just need to go there and just ask your question. Let me just scroll down to some of the questions. Just bear with me. Okay. Okay, good question. So Iqbal Hussein says, doesn't the argument from dependency only lead to the conclusion that the cause of the universe itself uncaused? How do we demonstrate that this uncaused necessary existence is God? Okay, so let me bring you back to an aspect of the webinar when we said, well, if the best explanation, or the only rational explanation for the dependency of the universe and the dependency of everything within the universe is a necessary being that is eternal and independent, then what does that sound like? If, you know, as we say colloquially in the English language, if it quacks like a duck and it looks like a duck, it's a duck, right? So from this point of view, if we've concluded there is a necessary being that's eternal and independent, which is the only rational explanation for the dependency of the universe and everything within it, then that just makes sense of God, because by definition, that's who God is. God is wajib al-wujud. He's the necessary existing. He is eternal. He is uncaused. Now, if you turn it around and say, well, maybe there is a cause for the universe, but this cause is also caused. What have you just done logically? All you're basically saying is that a dependent thing explains a dependent thing. But if you go back to one of the explanations that we tried to assess, the second explanation, which was the dependency of the universe and everything within it derives its existence from something else dependent. When we dealt with that, we understood that there was an absurdity of the infinite regress of dependencies, and it doesn't ultimately explain anything. In actual fact, what it does, it shows that if we postulate such an explanation, the universe wouldn't exist in the first place, as we discussed concerning the infinite regress of dependencies, the infinite regress of causes. So I hope that answers your question. And by the way, these webinars are recorded, and when you go to the sapiensinstitute.org/webinar page, you would see a button that says watch the previous recordings. When you click on that and you're trying to search for the video that you want to watch, when you click on the particular video, you may have to just give your name and email, and then you could watch and study the webinar again. And by the way, I forgot to mention this. If you go on the website, there is an essay that articulates this argument with all of the references. Usually when you see these webinars, there are a few references. I didn't put many references in there. Why? Because the essay with academic references are on the essay on our website. So go to www.sapiensinstitute.org, and if you scroll down on the latest readings or the latest posts, you would see an essay concerning divine link, the argument from dependency. Assalamu alaikum Hamza Bhai, please visit India. I would visit India when Modi is gone. Okay, so next question. Didn't Ibn al-Haytham come up with a scientific method? No, to be very fair, he was part of a chain, if you like, of intellectuals in history that helped formulate the scientific method, and Ibn al-Haytham was one of the key persons that were involved in that process. He wrote his book on optics and he formalized the scientific method. He didn't come up with it, but he was a key feature of the scientific method in terms of its formulation. Are we going to cover the composition of fallacy objection? Yes. This is probably a previous question. We have covered the fallacy of composition objection. So bear with me, this is a longer question here. Let me just go through the questions, bear with me. Okay, some of these questions were raised, I think, before we actually started the webinar. And some of these questions have already been answered, so just bear with me. And some of these some questions that you raise are not related to this webinar. What I suggest you do is go register for the particular webinar, and that you could raise your relevant questions. Or if it was a previous recording, listen to the recording again. And if you still haven't got a satisfactory response, then please email us, yeah? Just bear with me. Okay, good question. So Musab Munir says, this just shows the existence of a necessary cause. We can derive some attributes of this cause, but how do we make the jump from this necessary cause into a theistic God? Okay, well, look, let's think about very carefully about the very kind of essential basic definition of God in the Islamic tradition. So take Surah Ikhlas, for example. Allah says, Qul huwallahu ahad. Say Allah is uniquely one. He is, and then Allah continues, Allahu samad. Allah is self-sufficient, He's independent, right? Now, this is a very basic definition of the divine, which is in line with today's argument. That there is one necessary being and that he is independent. That's it. That's the basic understanding. Now, if you want to start to articulate other names and attributes such as Ar-Rahman, the merciful, Al-Hakim, the wise, if you want to start to talk about that he is Al-Latif, the subtle, if you want to start to talk about his Al-Bar, the source of all goodness, obviously this argument is not going to give you these attributes. That requires revelation. So you need an argument from revelation. You need to show that the Quran and the prophetic teachings are actually revelation, which is another webinar, which is another argument. But that's not the point. This doesn't undermine this argument, because what we have clearly shown is that there is a necessary being. And this is very important. And by the way, the necessary being has to be one, because if there are two necessary beings, then that takes away the feature of necessity, right? Because one, you say, well, why not three then? Why not four? Do you see? So, and the whole aspect of two necessary beings existing actually diminishes the concept of necessity. So the point I'm trying to say here is, if we've concluded there is an eternal independent being, then we've concluded that there is a God that is one and independent, which brought the whole universe into existence. That's all we need to do here. The next stage would therefore be to start to show that this God is actually Allah from the point of view of all the names and attributes that we affirm in the Quran and the Sunnah. But that requires an argument from revelation. But even so, it doesn't undermine this argument in any shape or form, because this argument is to show that we can have a good argument to prove that there is an independent necessary being, which makes sense of God. That's all you need to do. But you're right, the other names and attributes, you need revelation. But even in saying that, because these arguments are there to awaken the fitrah, because even within the fitrah, we already know within us that God exists and that he's worthy of extensive praise, right? And this could be an argument that awakens that within us, right? And that's why sometimes we think too much of rational philosophical arguments. We believe that they have to be, they have to prove everything about Allah. No, that's not the case at all. As long as it can show the basic kind of rububiyyah, the creative power and oneness of God, that's enough. That's enough to show that the God exists and it's in line with the Islamic tradition. To move further, then you have to talk about revelation and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And these are other webinars, and please register for them. We're going to have arguments for the Quran and arguments for the truthfulness of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so Musab Munir has said, given our current understanding of the Big Bang cosmology, the Big Bang is the point where all dimensions, including space and time, came into existence. Therefore, saying what caused the universe or what came before the universe becomes meaningless. That's not true at all, because when it comes to this argument, even if you postulate such a thing, that doesn't remove away, it doesn't diminish the fact that the universe is dependent, right? So if it's dependent, it requires an explanation, and therefore this argument applies. Now, your question is going to be answered further in the webinar that's going to talk about the Quranic argument for God's existence. But because it's such a typical atheist response, which is very unnuanced and it doesn't represent the academic discussion, I thought, let me just answer it anyway, yeah? Because, it's become an atheist cliche. So this is what they're basically saying. Let me just articulate your question in the following way. So there are some objectors, right, that they say that causality only makes sense in time. They maintain that since time began at the Big Bang, we cannot claim that something caused the universe because there was no before at the beginning of the Big Bang. In absence of time, there is no cause or effect because cause becomes before effect. And that's why they would say the question is meaningless. But this is actually a really silly objection. So there's a few points to do with this objection. I want you to listen carefully, and we're going to go into detail in the other webinar. The first point to understand is the view that causality only makes sense within time requires proof, right? In philosophy, there is no consensus on the definition and nature of causality, on the nature of the causal link. For example, there are various approaches that attempt to define and understand causality and causal relations. One such approach is simultaneous causality. This is the view that the causes always occur simultaneously with the immediate effects. So one can imagine that the universe and its cause occurred at the same time, for example. So taking into consideration, my brother, the following thought experiment that explains such causal relation. Imagine an eternal ball on an eternal pillow. The ball causes the indentation of the pillow, but the cause, which is the ball, does not come before the effect, which is the indentation of the pillow, as time is not a factor due to the eternality of the objects. So in the context of this argument, it could be that the moment God brought the universe into existence was the moment the universe came into being. And this type of causation is called as atemporal causation. So this means that the cause, in this case, God's will and power, occurred prior causally, but not prior temporally, not prior in time. So the cause and effect occurred simultaneously. That's the first point. Second point, it assumes there is a consensus on the notion of time in science. This is very basic level understanding of science, which unfortunately many atheists have a very basic understanding of these issues, because there are different notions of time in quantum mechanics and general relativity. To assume that there is only one conception of time misrepresents the literature. Third point to take in consideration, this objection is actually shooting oneself in the foot. It's self-defeating. If causality cannot exist without time, then the Big Bang should be rejected. Why? Because given that at the point of the Big Bang singularity there was no time, but a boundary to time, and the boundary to time is obviously causally connected to the rest of the universe, then how can this causal relation make sense with no time? If the objectors accept that the boundary is causally connected to the rest of the universe, they should also accept the same atemporal, so means timeless causation, relation when God decides to manifest his will and power to create the universe. If they maintain that causality doesn't make sense outside of time, they would have to reject the causal relation between the boundary of the singularity to the rest of the universe, which is tantamount, which is equivalent of rejecting the universe itself. Now, the objector can argue that some physicists maintain that the universe has no boundary, but this has no consensus and it's a contentious issue. The point here is it's self-defeating, because if the Big Bang is true, or one particular model of the Big Bang is true, because there are 17 different models to explain the data, the boundary of the Big Bang, time, there is no time. But the rest of the universe is causally connected to the boundary where there is no time. So if they say, time, there being no time means that you can't say there's any cause, well then how on earth do you explain the universe? Because the rest of the universe is causally connected to the boundary, which there is no time. So it's a really misplaced objection. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail, hopefully, next time. Okay, another question by Raida Jarrah. Why do we say the universe is dependent? Have we seen any other universe to compare? You don't need any other universe to compare. Say, for example, I pick up a rock. If I pick up a rock and I say the rock has limited physical qualities, certain size, shape, color, weight, volume, and I say that, the rock, by virtue of what we've perceived, didn't have to be here, it didn't have to exist, it could have not existed. These postulations do not require me to see another rock. These are first principles. You don't need another rock. For example, if you were to see a hovering golden ball in a park, and it's the only hovering golden ball you've ever seen in your life, and it's the only one that you're ever going to see in your life, do you need another golden hovering ball to perceive, to make the conclusion that this golden hovering ball is dependent? Of course not. By virtue of the fact that you can raise these questions, that the golden hovering ball didn't have to be there, there's nothing necessary about its existence, it has limited physical qualities, by virtue of that, you could now conclude that it doesn't necessarily exist and therefore it is dependent. Let me just go through some more questions. Bear with me. Well, that's the whole point. So Shahbaz Afraj says, can you give an example for observable necessary being or observable necessary arrangement? No, you can't, because the minute you observe it, then that's the minute that it's not necessary anymore. Because a striking feature of dependent things is that they have limited physical qualities, and anything that we observe is always going to have limited physical qualities. You're never able to observe necessary beings or necessary things, and that also shows the limitations of the philosophy of science. Science, as Professor Elliot Sober, who's also an atheist, in his essay Empiricism, he says that scientists are limited to the observations they have at hand. And observations, by virtue of them being observations, have limited physical qualities. So it's not the case that you can observe something that is necessary. So I hope that's helpful, and I don't see how that question in some way undermines the argument. Just because you can't see something that's necessary, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That would presume a kind of the metaphysics of empiricism, that the only knowledge that you can have is through some type of observation, and that needs proof. You can't just assume that. Okay, I'm just going through the questions, just bear with me. Okay, so a question here says, okay, can we argue for the necessary existence of matter using the following argument? Matter has necessary existence, for though it undergoes change, The given volume of matter found in the universe persists, and as persisting matter does not have or need a cause, this accords with the principle of conservation of mass energy, according to which matter and energy are never lost, but rather transmute into each other, which, by the way, only applies within the universe. As instructible, then, matter is necessary being. Hence, though the material components of the universe are contingent vis-a-vis their form, they are necessary vis-a-vis their existence. On this reading, there is none but one necessary beings, all internal to the universe. Let me try and unpack that question. So you're saying that matter is necessary by virtue of their existence, okay? Because you're saying that matter is uncaused. Well, that's not an issue here. Something being uncaused in this context can only mean that that can only mean that that you're claiming now the matter is eternal. Even if matter was eternal, yeah, that doesn't now mean that it's necessary. That's, yes, for something to be necessary, it has to be eternal, but just because something is eternal, it doesn't mean it's necessary. Now, obviously, from an Islamic theological perspective, we may disagree, but say from a philosophical perspective, if you were to say, well, it's uncaused, therefore it's necessary, no. You're just saying it's eternal. And it doesn't necessarily follow that just because something is eternal, it means it's necessary. Although for something to be necessary, it has to be eternal, okay? So now you have to now try and show something other than its uncaused nature that makes matter necessary. And you can't. By virtue of the fact that you know it has a particular size, volume, it has limited physical qualities, even if it's really, really, really large. By virtue of the fact that it didn't have to be there, it could have not existed. So you really have to apply the other concepts of dependency on matter in order for you to have more of a stronger argument. Where do you find your book in Pakistan? The Amazon prices are insane. Don't worry, the book is going to be available free on the Sapiens Institute website this week, inshallah. It was supposed to be last week, but inshallah it'll be free this week. Okay. These are some really, really good questions from you guys. Honestly, I'm really impressed. Unfortunately, I can take only one more question. What we could do is when we do this webinar again, or what we could do is an open webinar for spend like 2 hours addressing all the questions on certain topics. So we're not ignoring your questions. It's just that we have only time for one more question. Okay, Musab is saying, can you talk a bit about the concept of infinity and actual infinite is possible as a link to this cosmological argument? I could do that, but let's do that when we talk about the Quranic argument for God's existence, which I believe is next week or sometime in August, inshallah. Because for now, it doesn't really 100% relate to the topic. Okay, Shahabaz Afraj says, what is the advantage of the contingency argument over the Kalam cosmological argument? In my view, the advantage of the contingency argument is that it's in line with all the schools of creed in the Islamic tradition without much contention compared to the Kalam cosmological argument. Also, one of the premises of the Kalam cosmological argument, you have to prove that the universe had a beginning. Usually people would focus on mathematics or cosmological evidence, and that requires a lot of unpacking. But to be honest, you know, the deeper you go, they're both really the same from that point of view. But I like the contingency argument because, you know, it transcends any type of empirical data, is based on first principles. But, you know, to unpack this question, give you a better answer, I'll have to do it probably another webinar, inshallah. Okay, just bear with me. Oops, sorry, I was going the wrong direction. I was going up rather than down now. 1 second. So many questions. I'm really impressed, guys. You know, may Allah bless all of you. It shows that you guys are thinking. Okay. So many questions. All right. Well, I have to go now. Um, I hope this was useful. Remember, we're committed to your well-being and your empowerment. It doesn't stop here. These webinars are not, they're in depth, but they're not like, you know, voluminous from the point of view that we're spending a whole day. To be honest, sometimes with these type of things, we have to spend more than 2 hours together. And inshallah, we will do that. The Sapiens Institute is dedicated to your well-being. We're going to have courses online and offline that are going to go into much more detail. May Allah bless you, and Jazakallah for your time and giving me the opportunity to even share some of my ideas. And there is going to be a recording of this. Go on the website, register for the other ones, and we're going to have more of an open Q&A in the future as well. But as for now, may Allah bless you. Anything that I've said that is good and correct has come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything that is wrong has come from shaitan and my nafs and my ego. May Allah bless every single one of you, and may Allah bless you and your families and shower you all with His boundless love and mercy. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.